كيتي فين الكلمة بتاعتي؟
Well, a very good day, all who are joining us. My name is Brian Finlay. I'm the president and CEO here at the Stimson Center. We're really grateful to all of you that were able to tune in and join us today for this discussion in advance of COP26. We're really pleased to be co-hosting this event with the British Embassy here in Washington. A special thanks to you, Ambassador Pierce, for making this possible. You are a very busy woman, I know, in the lead up to COP, and we're really grateful to you for making the time to join us. Maybe just a quick word, if I may, of introduction for those that are joining us that may be less familiar with the Stimson Center. First, shame on you. Where have you been that you don't know about Stimson? And secondly, I will tell you that Stimson is a nonpartisan public policy think tank. We have offices here in Washington and in Brussels. And at Stimson, we really take pride, and I think it's what differentiates us from others on not just our nonpartisanship, but also our commitment to research and action. I like to say that our work really goes beyond just merely admiring the problem. We are driven to research, to develop, and ultimately to work with partners around the world to advance practical solutions to grand global challenges. And I think there's no better exemplar of this commitment than Stimson's Environmental Security Program, which of course is run by the incomparable Sally Yozel. You'll be hearing more from Sally in just a minute. Sally and her team conduct analysis on an array of pressing environmental threats, from illegal fishing to wildlife trafficking, and of course, the climate emergency. So we're in for a real treat here today. We're so grateful to have two distinguished panelists join us this morning. They each bring many years of foreign policy experience representing their governments abroad around the world. A warm welcome to Dame Karen Pierce. Ambassador Pierce is, of course, London's envoy to Washington, and also Egyptian Ambassador Motazza Khan. Ambassador, we're grateful, really deeply grateful for your willingness to join us today. So COP begins in just 3 weeks, postponed for a year, as you know, as a result of COVID-19. The conference is really taking place at what is a truly extraordinary moment when signs of climate catastrophe are literally everywhere. Extreme weather events, flooding, drought, and accelerating environmental degradation are not just threats in and of themselves, but they're also fueling economic, food, and water insecurity around the globe. And literally no corner of the globe, wealthy, developing, north, south, highlands, coastal regions, is immune from the devastating consequences of the climate crisis. So as the world seeks to build back better from COVID-19, it's clear that business as usual is really not an option any longer, and the stakes to get this right are truly terrifyingly high, unfortunately. So at COP26, the international community will need to work not only to reset the race to zero, they will need to simultaneously set up to win the race to resilience as well. And I think our panel today is ideally suited to help us explore the root of those races, and I look forward to hearing from them. But first, let me introduce my colleague, Sally Yozel, who will be moderating today's discussion. I suspect for most on this call, Sally needs no introduction. She is the director, of course, of Stimson's Environmental Security Program, as I mentioned. To that position, she brings a vast experience in climate policy from her time spent working on Capitol Hill, at NOAA, and more recently at the State Department, where she served as the senior ocean advisor to John Kerry when he was Secretary of State. Since joining Stimson, Sally has translated her global climate knowledge and experience into the CORVI, the Climate and Ocean Risk Vulnerability Index. And if I may brag for a moment, because Sally will not, CORVI is a decision support tool that helps coastal cities to assess risks and take action to address climate change in a much more holistic manner. This tool, in my humble view, really has the opportunity to fundamentally reshape our efforts to address the changing climate by helping donors as well as investors alike to more efficiently allocate not just assistance, but also capital to meet growing demand. So at present, CORVI assessments are underway in 8 cities around the world, where again, it is being used to integrate economic, social, and environmental risk factors and help decision makers in urban areas to prioritize and expend what are, of course, limited resources much more efficiently. And I hope you can learn, in fact, more about the CORVI by visiting the address just behind my head here. But I really would encourage you all to take a moment to explore how CORVI might be used to leverage your own work, whether you are in government, in industry, or in the NGO community. And so with that, ladies and gentlemen, I give you Sally Gozell.
Well, thank you, Brian, for setting the scene with your opening remarks, and thank you, for that kind introduction. But most importantly, thank you also to the British Embassy for co-hosting today's event, and to all of you for joining this important discussion on how we can really mobilize, finance, upgrade actions, and ensure a successful COP26. So the world has really woken up to the scale of the climate crisis. I mean, just a few weeks ago during the UN General Assembly, nearly every head of state highlighted the urgent need for action, and some of the world's greatest polluters made commitments to change. The US announced it was doubling its climate finance contribution to $11 billion, and even China pledged to end financing new coal plants overseas. So these are just a few of the efforts which are so crucial if we're going to meet the global target to limit warming below 2 degrees Celsius as set out in the Paris Agreement. But so much more needs to be done. The latest assessment from the World Meteorological Organization last month show that current country commitments are still grossly insufficient to limit global warming. And the Global Commission on Adaptation estimates that $180 billion is needed per year to adapt to the impacts that we already see today. So make no mistake about this, folks. We are in the fight of our lives. We are seeing the impacts of climate change across the globe every single day. Over 30 million people were displaced by climate-related events just last year alone. And the insurance giant Swiss Re is estimating that the climate crisis could reduce global economic output by as much as 14% by 2050. And this year we've seen devastating floods across Europe and China. Wildfires still rage in the Western United States. And with just 2 months left to go in our hurricane season, the US National Weather Service has run through the alphabet. And that's how they name their storms, major storms. And sadly, in August, the UN said Madagascar is on the brink of the world's first climate change famine. So as I'm sure we'll hear from Ambassador Zaran, the African continent is facing climate-induced water scarcity, drought, land desertification, all of which threaten economic and food security. So all of this really underscores the growing impact of climate change to the safety and security of communities around the world. And these impacts were confirmed in the latest IPCC report, which concluded we have already seen widespread and rapid changes in every region where people live across the globe, from rural farms to coastal cities. No place is safe from the impacts of climate change. So as we head into COP, the world is really getting a sense of the vast funding requirements needed to adapt to climate change. And so we're really going to get into that today. So let us begin our discussion. I mean, we have such an amazing panel with us today. I'd like to take a moment to introduce our esteemed panelists, Ambassador Dame Karen Pierce and Ambassador Motaz Zahran. Ambassador Pierce is the British ambassador to the United States, and among her many distinguished posts, she previously served as the United Kingdom's permanent representative to the United Nations and Director General for Political Affairs and Chief Operating Officer of the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Ambassador Motaz Zahran is the Egyptian ambassador to the United States, and prior to arriving in Washington, he served as the Assistant Foreign Minister and Chief of Cabinet at the Egyptian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was the Egyptian ambassador to Canada and has held numerous other positions from Egypt's Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So thank you both for joining us today. It is such an honor to have the current COP26 represented and the next COP27 represented. Of course, I would prefer to be doing this in person, but I'm really happy to have us all virtually together for this critical and timely discussion. And that's really what I want to do today, is have a conversation, not only between the three of us, but with the impressive and vast audience joining from all around the world. So to begin, we'll talk about some of the issues related to mobilizing climate finance, then increasing climate adaptation, and talk about some of the nature-based solutions as well. And when we're done, I'm going to open it up to the audience. So if you are a member of the audience, please ask questions. There's a box, the Q&A box in the bottom right corner, and we'll be monitoring that. So let us begin. And we'll start with Ambassador Pierce. Ambassador Pierce, thousands of people are heading to Glasgow in just a few weeks as your government hosts COP26. Prime Minister Boris Johnson has spoken consistently about the need for developed countries to meet climate finance commitments. Recently, as I noted, the UN General Assembly, President Biden announced that the US would increase its climate finance commitment to $11 billion. However, at previous COPs, as it has been shown, sustaining these financial commitments is really difficult. So what can be done at COP26 to encourage all nations to raise and sustain that financial ambition?
Well, thanks very much, Sally, and hello, everybody. And a special hello to my very good friend, the Egyptian ambassador. Egypt and the UK have been working together on various aspects of COP, both at the UN and bilaterally. So it's great to be on a panel with you, Ambassador. It's a very good charge, Sally, about the finance. And all I can say is that we are determined that this COP shouldn't go the way of the others on finance. So President Biden's commitment to double the US funding by 2024 is very welcome. As the UK, we have doubled our own climate finance to nearly $16 billion in the next 4 years, aiming for a 50-50 mitigation and adaptation split, because we believe that's critical to support the most vulnerable. The aim is to get a $100 billion delivery plan at Glasgow, at COP, and Germany and Canada are doing that work to scale up climate finance, and that is absolutely critical, as you say. But we don't believe that public funding alone will be able to make the difference. So we are doing a lot of work to get private sector financing. We have Mark Carney, who's the UN Special Envoy for Climate Action. He also works for the British government as a finance advisor for COP26. And we have a champion for climate action. And together, we've set up the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And this is all about attracting private sector funding. We have over 250 firms from 30 countries, and the asset that represents is over $88 trillion. So we are really trying to bring the private sector into this. There's more that can be done, but I think we would absolutely agree with you about the importance of the 100 billion target. I think it's worth my saying that to achieve all the COP goals, to achieve the finance goals, we actually need to transform the global financial system. And that means adjusting business models. It means developing credible plans for transition. It means sustainable investments. And it means putting climate factors into the audit process. So we agree, this is a very important task.
Thank you, Ambassador. Wow, a lot going on, and what commitments, both from the private sector as well as the UK government. And I like that mitigation and adaptation mix. That's so important. So, Ambassador Zaran, keeping sort of on this theme, there is this significant push to meet the $100 billion target, as Ambassador Pierce just outlined, at COP26. But obviously, much more over the long term is going to be needed to mitigate the effects of climate change and build resilience on the impacts already underway. You know, as I noted in my opening, we read over the weekend and are very excited that the next COP, COP27, Egypt has been chosen as the nominee. And so congratulations on that. But as COP26 ends in November, and we pivot on to COP27 and beyond, how do you think this really important financial ambition can be sustained?
Well, thank you very much. I'm extremely delighted to be with you today on this panel discussion on a very pertinent and timely issue that concerns us all. Let me just commend the Stimson Center and the British Embassy as well for organizing this event, and special tribute to Ambassador Pierce. Hello, and I'm delighted to be with you on the panel. Now, on finance ambition, definitely there is this ambition that we all, target in terms of having Glasgow look at the 100 billion target and maybe beyond. And let me just highlight, before entering into the details, on Egypt a little bit, because we've just been nominated and we're happy to be the nominee for COP27. So whatever we will be doing in COP27 will definitely be building up on our achievements in Glasgow. So this is number one point. Number two, let me just say that Egypt has announced that we would work to make the conference a turning point in international climate efforts, in coordination, of course, with all parties, for the benefit not only for Africa, because this is where you've made your statement in the very beginning about the implications of climate change on Africa itself, but also to the entire world. Now, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry announced that Egypt would be selected as the nominee, and here we are again in a driving seat when it comes to both the UK and Egypt, who have partnered together and coincidentally hosting one after the other the climate summit. So this is a source of pride. So we welcome and encourage the US efforts led by President Biden, by Special Envoy Kerry, to achieve progress on climate finance. And we, of course, take note of the advancements that will be made in terms of doubling the resources. Now, Egypt, the vision over here is simple, and it is cornered where in regarding climate change as anchored in the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities. We thus support adequate and predictable climate finance. We also hope that consultations extend to commitments for the period after 2025. Now, the 100 billion finance target annually has not been achieved, and there are certain restrictions on how to achieve the target. But then again, Ambassador Pierce spoke about not only public spending, but also private spending, which has to be channeled as well in order to meet the target. But we're starting to see a new phase that requires also mobilization of resources to implement the Paris Agreement. Accordingly, we expect a higher ceiling. So will developed countries be able to fulfill the goal? Will private sector be able to partner effectively with the public sector? Well, this remains probably a cardinal question that we need to continue to follow and propagate for. Now, climate finance also requires discussion on Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, particularly on carbon pricing. Egypt supports the share of proceeds scheme, which amounts to 2% of certified emission reductions issued for a clean development mechanism, the CDM, and this is where we think things should be headed. We also support the call by the UN Secretary General for a 50-50 split of climate finance between mitigation and adaptation. And finally, Egypt, along with other African countries, have reservations on providing climate finance through development aid. And I think this is something that we have all come to recognize, or even special draw rights or special withdrawal rights, simply because they are unrelated to climate finance, and according to both the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement, which also indicate the same. So we need to be more creative into finding the adequate sources to continue to finance at the level of our target, and maybe also to exceed that level.
Well, thank you very much for that, Ambassador Zaran. And, you know, I think you raise a lot of really good points about, you know, the need to represent and bring Africa, the African nations to the table. And particularly both ambassadors have talked about the 50-50 split between mitigation and adaptation that you have embraced. And so I wanted to ask a question sort of related to that adaptation piece, which is, you know, nature-based solutions. I mean, nature-based solutions are really key for adaptation. They're a big part of the puzzle to financing the protection of nature and nature-based solutions. I mean, nature plays such an important role when it comes to the fight, whether it's, you know, protecting mangroves and seagrass beds, coral reefs, and marshes. All of them have a role in protecting coastlines against the impacts of climate. So considering that, I was just looking at this recent review. It's called the Das-Gupta review. It was commissioned, in fact, by the UK government. And it made clear that nature underpins the sustainable economic development of about 1.2 billion jobs, which are directly related to effective management and sustainability of ecosystems. So that's a really important area that we need to continue to be part of the climate finance outcomes. So Ambassador Pierce, let me ask you a question about that. How would you propose to further integrate nature into the climate and action agenda, and specifically into countries' nationally determined contributions?
Well, it's a critical part of what we're trying to do, as you say, Sally. There's no viable pathway to keeping the 1.5 degree target in reach that doesn't involve protecting nature, restoring nature on an unprecedented scale. We believe that forests and land use related actions have the potential to deliver up to 30% of the emissions reductions needed to hit 1.5 degrees. And we think part of this lies in recognizing that fact. So elevating nature to the same level as emission reduction as a target. And that's one of the things we want to do at COP26. And in terms of specific nature things, we're asking countries to do three things. First of all, is this high-level political commitment to strengthen sustainable land use and agriculture and support the conservation of forests and ecosystems. The second thing is we're encouraging countries to support the forest, agriculture and commodities trade dialogue. And that dialogue is about, in a cooperative, collaborative way, trying to find actions that countries need to take to tackle deforestation, which is driven by international trade in agriculture commodities, while, as you mentioned, supporting those communities who rely on that trade for their livelihoods. And third, we're back to finance. We need more finance for nature. We have announced that some $5 billion of our $13 billion committed international climate finance will be allocated to climate change activity that supports biodiversity and protects nature. So we are hoping that at COP26, we'll be able to get countries together to commit the level of resource needed to reverse deforestation. And that will again have to include private sector finance, as well as public sector, and a proper set of projects in tropical and subtropical countries.
Thank you, Ambassador Pierce. I mean, again, we've all been at this game for quite a while, and so much early on was such a focus on mitigation, but bringing in the adaptation piece, I mean, I'm not going to say on equal footing, but definitely heightening its importance on really safeguarding biodiversity and nature as part of the solution is so important. And Ambassador Zaran, Egypt co-chairs the Adaptation Action Coalition, and the coalition's work is designed to do just that: elevate adaptation in the UN's climate negotiations. So what do you see, what in your view are some of the barriers to expanding and enhancing climate adaptation? Like, what needs to be done to overcome these barriers and ensure that climate adaptation measures are really prioritized alongside the very important mitigation measures as well?
Well, thank you very much. An extremely pertinent question. I think, mitigation is more of, dealing with the imminent problem, and adaptation is probably more of the imminence of the problem as well as its short-term and medium and long-term solutions. So that is why adaptation needs to be elevated in the agenda when it comes to climate change, and to a level that matches the attention given to mitigation. Now, the main barriers to climate adaptation are essentially related to the necessity of unlocking Article 6, as I've mentioned before, when it comes to the Paris Agreement, to help finance adaptation projects. We are somewhat concerned about a renewed emphasis on carbon neutrality, more than adaptation itself. Bearing in mind that the adaptation is the main issue for Africa, whose contribution to emissions is extremely very limited, whereas Africa is the most affected, as you've mentioned, by climate change on different fronts. We are also concerned that developing countries could be overburdened with the commitments that exceed the Paris Agreement at a time when these countries are facing immense economic and social and public health challenges. So we believe here that adaptation is more relevant to the priorities of developing countries who face extreme weather conditions and the natural disasters as floods and hurricanes, desertification, and yes, the deforestation as well, and droughts, and all the catastrophes you could think of when it comes to climate change as the main instigator, as well as other relatively slow climate phenomena like the rising sea levels, for example. So these are all that come together in terms of affecting the African continent, but also the developing nations as a whole. So Egypt is affected also by climate change due to the rising sea level here, and its impact on the Nile Delta and the soil salinity, as well as challenges related to water scarcity, especially with the construction of the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam without environmental impact assessments. And this is a real unfortunate development that negotiations here are continuing to stall and to be, not in a good place. But this is not the issue of today's discussion. So I'll just continue with what I have to say on climate, and say the following: that according to a UN report on global water development in 2020, giant dam reservoirs in general increased the emission of gases, mainly methane, that lead to global warming. So this is not specific to a specific dam, but as a general notion that governs the construction of dams as a whole. So noteworthy to highlight that the African Adaptation Initiative that you've referred to was launched by President Sisi during the Paris conference in 2015, as we consider this initiative to be an adequate framework for cooperation between African countries and the US in a specific aspect of this domain. So we're looking into agreements or arrangements to host the initiative's headquarters, which is a good also development on the part of exhibiting the political will that you've spoken about earlier. And we also hope that the US can join the Adaptation Ambition coalition that we also launched and co-chair with the UK. And the coalition is concerned with adaptation initiatives on the international level, especially in developing countries. And this is one way of also exhibiting how Egypt and the UK are extremely collaborative on this important matter.
Well, thank you. Let me ask you a little bit more about that, Ambassador, if I could, Ambassador Zaron. The Adaptation Ambition Coalition, I mean, I think that sounds like, I can't imagine why anyone would not want to join that, and good for both the UK government and the Egyptian government for joining forces and really leading there. I also know that, I mean, you've just really highlighted on a number of critical issues. I mean, the Nile Basin, as you say, the salinity issue, the water scarcity issue, and just the whole thought of adaptation being so important to African countries as a priority not versus mitigation, but just keeping in mind the future growth and importance of your economic development. Well, with that, I know that you are preparing to launch the country's national strategy for adaptation on climate change and disaster risk reduction. And I'm under the impression, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's really going to try to bring in both the private sector into your future, not only planning, but actions. And so my question is, on this whole adaptation front, how do you involve the private sector and utilize the kind of market mechanisms to raise this financial ambition for Egypt and many of your neighboring countries?
Well, thank you for the question. It's extremely pertinent, and it also carries a lot of from what Ambassador Pierce had to say about public and private coming together. Now, Egypt is a regional pioneer when it comes to utilizing market mechanisms for climate efforts, as we were the first country in the Middle East to issue green bonds. And the green bonds are here to finance projects that address climate change. Now, green bonds, again, as you know, are debt instruments to obtain financing for projects related to climate or environment. Crédit Agricole, CIB, and the HSBC holding banks were structural advisors. Citigroup, Crédit Agricole, Deutsche Bank, and HSBC are also or were hired as joint managers for the offering. Now, Egypt has a total portfolio of eligible green projects that amounts to 1.9 billion USD, of which approximately 16% is renewable energy, and 19% clean transportation, 26% sustainable water and wastewater management, and 39% pollution prevention and control. Now, the issuance of green bonds was welcomed by all stakeholders as a reflection of the commitment on the part of Egypt to sustainability. We are currently working on the first national strategy for climate change, as you've mentioned. And in general, Egypt has witnessed quantum leaps ahead and achieved major strides in sustainability, especially in energy transformation and increasing the renewable energy component in our energy consumption, as we aim for renewable energy to comprise 42% of our energy map. And this is actually part of the main target of our national strategy for energy consumption that we've adopted just lately. So the main trajectory is definitely one that embraces public and private, because of the conviction that neither one on its own would be able to cater to overcoming and advancing with projects that are related to either mitigation or, and at the very height of our attention, is adaptation.
Well, the green bonds are really, as you pointed out, have been very successful in a number of ways across so many areas, which you laid out to improve the sustainability. You know, I'm going to ask Ambassador Pierce one more question, and just remind folks in the audience, if you have questions you would like to ask to either of the ambassadors, please put them in our Q&A question and answer section box on the right, and we'll ask those momentarily. So, Ambassador Pierce, we're keeping on this same theme of developed and developing countries and adaptation and finance, private and public finance. When I think about the Commonwealth, it's large. 24. It consists of 24 small island developing states, or SIDS, and I think it's something like 13 least developed countries, or LDCs. And when you think about SIDS and LDCs, they're both very vulnerable to, and least likely to be able to really recover from the impacts of climate change, whether it's heat or drought, sea level rise, storms. And the UK government and the Commonwealth Secretariat, I understand, have been really working closely together to support many of the climate adaptation and resiliency planning for and amongst and with the SIDS and LDCs. But what I read is there are still a lot of vulnerabilities that remain for these countries. And from your perspective, how can we overcome some of the barriers to really help these countries build more resilience across SIDS and LDCs? And what can governments and the private sectors do together to enhance their preparedness?
Sure. Well, as you say, Sally, it's a really important issue. And when I was at the United Nations, those 24 SIDS from the Commonwealth are joined by some 30 others right the way across the globe. And we have at the UN, in the UN context, a special caucus that looks at climate issues from their particular perspective. A number of things in terms of the scale of the problem stand out. One is not just the dangers and the risks from sea level rise, it's also the sheer surface that some of those countries have to cover in terms of how they look after their own ecosystem and environment, both marine and terrestrial. And that in itself is a big challenge. One of the other things that came out of the UN discussion was to show that some of the climate finance instruments that have been developed do not actually answer the needs of these individual countries. Some of that is a capability issue in those countries. Some of it is that the tools are designed for a different problem in a way. So we've got to look at those, and we've got to find ways of adapting them to the particular needs of the SIDS. I do want to salute what Egypt has been doing on adaptation, which has been fantastic. The other things we're looking at is, again, back to finance, trying to get more finance for adaptation in these countries. We also do have a capability obstacle. We need to increase our technical assistance and know-how so that adaptation projects can actually get off the ground and be undertaken successfully. And then we need to support local communities, including through direct assistance, because they are the ones who understand their environment best. This means fundamentally a partnership with the SIDS and the LDCs so that we can help them get the best of what assistance is on offer. The UK has something called the PACT programme. This is about providing finance to public, private sector, civil society in the SIDS and LDCs so that they can accelerate their own transition to low carbon development and hence meet the Paris commitments. And we just announced another $300 million of funding to that program. We're also engaged in helping countries share lessons learned. That's often one of the most powerful things they can do. And in keeping with that, we want to put an emphasis on indigenous and traditional knowledge. And we can do this partly through partnership with Egypt and others, but we can also help local communities champion what they're doing and ensure that their views are taken into account on resiliency building. And that's really important. And then we have a risk-informed early action partnership, which is about scaling up investment in early warning systems. And if we can get this off the ground, we'll have made 1 billion people safer from disaster by 2025. So it's multifaceted.
Thank you for that, and a lot going on, and it's so important to the LDCs and SIDS. I will note that we, Ambassador Zahn, it looks like has just signed off for a moment. For those in Washington, there's been a gas leak in that area of DC. So I suspect he's moved out of the harm's way, and we'll see if he comes back or not, but all is well. So moving on, it's a perfect time to segue into a lot of questions which are starting to come in from our audience. And one of the questions that seems to be pretty prevalent is, what more can NGOs do, civil society? How can governments assist NGOs and civil society and regular citizens? Beyond government. I don't know, Ambassador Pierce, if you have any thoughts about that. You just talked a little bit about the PACT program, which is helping support civil society in communities. Are there any other thoughts you have, particularly coming into COP where so many NGOs and citizens will be joining?
There'll be a huge civil society element at COP. Which is great. And hopefully ideas will come out of that on how to take action at the citizen level, community level, on the main COP themes. I'd have thought that nature and these resilience partnerships are key for civil society, to be honest. But obviously civil society plays a very important role in holding everyone's feet to the fire and ensuring that governments and big corporations and the international organizations all live up to their commitments. But in terms of specific action, I think a lot of utility of what civil society can do lies around the nature-based solutions and building resilience at the community level.
Well, sort of adding on to that, nature-based solutions in the community level and, support from NGOs, civil society, academia, it brings to mind how daunting adaptation can be, particularly in concert with mitigation. And one of the questions we have coming in is that it's particularly daunting at the national level when you have to address the economic issues, the social issues, and the nature-based solution issues all at once. I mean, forget if we didn't even have climate change. Most, countries have to deal with those issues on a regular basis. So, thinking about how the Commonwealth supports so many countries around the world, how do they support and help and deal with these competing priorities, social, economic, environmental, when it comes to climate change sort of merging together?
Sure. I think one important point is to recognize that they're all linked, which sounds easy, but actually if you're trying to devise public policy, sometimes it's difficult to know where to start. So we put a lot of emphasis on COP being a whole of society COP, so that we can look at the interrelations between all these different strands, as you say, and work out what is the best order in which to tackle problems. And we can put communities together in the sense of scientific and other communities in the hope that they can reinforce and expand each other's efforts. So there's something very important about synergy there. But these things are not easy. As we had these problems before climate came to be recognized as code red. All the more important we work out where pulling one lever results in an effect somewhere else. So it's a lot of work, but I think one of the most encouraging things is the way, under UN auspices, countries across the globe have been really working hard together to get their public policy in order on these important questions. And as I mentioned earlier, we in Egypt have a very good partnership, but there are lots of other developing countries involved, Bangladesh, Rwanda. Everybody is trying really hard to get the public policy balance right between all the different sectors.
Yeah, I mean, I think you just raised absolutely all of the right points there. I mean, as we live every day, the world is integrated. Both countries are, country, people, and the policy issues are integrated. And we just can't look at this in a siloed manner anymore. I mean, we have to approach it in a realistic worldview of how integrated the topics, issues that are facing. So we have a question here that is really focused on COP and some of the, the big polluted countries. China being one of them, obviously the US is another. What are we expecting, or maybe we're not there yet, I don't know, out of China and the US and, some of the big polluting countries at the upcoming COP?
Well, we've already got the US finance commitment, which is great. That's a doubling. We've got President Biden's commitment about the targets for net zero, which is also fantastic. I think what we need from China is something on the same scale. China is a very important partner on climate. We've always said that whatever the tensions elsewhere, we in the US and others really want to work with China. I think it's true to say that in biodiversity terms, something like the 3 most polluted rivers of plastics in the world are in India and China. So it's obvious that we need to work with them and to get their contributions. We'd really appeal to the Chinese to come on board with that goal. It's a UN goal. It's a multilateral goal. It benefits a huge range of countries, especially developing countries. I know that China has made a commitment not to invest in coal-powered electricity stations around the world, and that's helpful. We need more countries to make that commitment, but there's also something very important about reducing carbon at home in a country that has such a powerful economy as China and the US do. So I think that is probably the next stage out of those countries. We all know that you can't switch an economy overnight. There has to be a transition. Community livelihoods depend on that. But it's about getting on with the transition. We in the UK have put a lot of emphasis on the jobs and economic growth that can come from tackling climate change. And we've had over 700,000 jobs created by our activities to tackle climate change. So we really would encourage people other countries to look at the transition in a positive light. It is not necessarily always about stopping things. Sometimes you find that starting things can actually boost economic growth in the climate sense.
Yeah, well, we keep hearing about the terms of building back better, and I think that is what that transition is all about. We need to do that without a doubt. So I see a question in the question and answer that is obviously near and dear to my heart. Ambassador Pierce, as you know, I've been working on ocean and fisheries issues most of my career. There's we have heard this before, and I can even remember back when I was at the State Department. Often coastal resilience and ocean issues are secondary. There's the mitigation issues, and for years we've had the carbon sequestration from forests and renewable and mitigation with renewable energy and whatnot. But when I think about where we are today with nature-based solutions, there has been a lot more, it seems, focus on ocean and coastal issues. Do you know, as we come up to COP26, will there be much focus on ocean and coastal resilience issues, the importance of fisheries and just sustainable ocean and coastal habitats moving forward?
It's a really important area, as you say, and I think the SIDS can be proud of the way they've brought it to global attention in the past 2 years. Because I think you're right, prior to that, there was a bit of a tendency to treat it as a secondary issue, but now we think it's absolutely critical to solving the overall problem. And the UK has just joined the initiative to protect 30% of the waters around the UK. And we have a number of aid and assistance investments in helping other countries manage their water and marine systems. I don't know the extent, I'm afraid, to which marine aspects will be front and center at COP, because there are other conferences taking place that will look specifically at the marine environment. But I think we all know that, especially in terms of sustainability and adaptation and communities coming to grips with the risks, marine environment fisheries is an integral part.
Absolutely. And you're right. There are a lot of, fortunately, there are a lot of some great conferences, the UN Ocean Conference, our Ocean Conference, the Secretary Kerry has organized over the years. So let me ask you one other question I see in the chat that I know is near and dear to your heart, and that is, getting youth involved. Climate change has been garnering more and more public attention, and youth have really been central to that attention. What kind of role do you see them playing moving forward in helping us build the climate ambition, as well as what kind of role are we expecting to see at COP with youth?
Yeah, no, it's hugely important. And there's a moral issue there as well. We inherited the planet in a certain state. We owe it to our children to hand the planet to them in a better state. And so that moral dimension is very important. And the commitment of young people has been right at the front and center of what tackling climate change is all about. There will be a separate youth summit on climate, which the Italians, who are our co-chairs of COP26, Italy will hold that youth summit just before COP26. So that's a great moment. I also think the involvement of youth is changing the politics on this. You see it even here in the States that some people in the Republican Party are starting to say they risk losing young voters if they don't have a more positive approach to tackling climate change. So that's a very interesting dimension, and I think it's only set to grow.
Yeah, that makes such sense, and so important to have that youth summit right before we go into COP, so that young people around the world can really ramp up the pressure on the policymakers as we walk into COP26. Well, I'm being mindful of our time, so what I'd like to do, Ambassador Pierce, is just give you one last question, a general question, which is really, as we close today and we're a few weeks before COP, is there one takeaway you'd like to really leave with all of us before we head into this really important meeting?
I think it's to keep up the pressure, keep up the, keep looking for ways for public policy to be advanced in ways that support tackling climate change. And that doesn't mean digging up motorways and that sort of thing. But it does mean letting your elected representatives know that this is important to you and that you would like to see public policy do even more to get a transition economy and to tackle these adaptation issues, including for developing countries. So that would be my main message, I think.
Well, that's terrific. What a great way to end a call to action to keep up the pressure. So folks, let me just say thank you very much, Ambassador Pierce, and to Ambassador Zaran for joining us and taking time out of their incredibly busy schedules for this really thoughtful discussion. And I look forward to seeing all of you who has joined us today, as well as ambassadors, in Glasgow. It's just a few weeks away. And so really, thank you both for providing us with a lot of good ideas as we head into COP and beyond. And thanks to everyone.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.